go.
Campaign 2025 begins. The Prime Minister on a drive at dawn to visit the Governor-General. Shortly after, cannon fire across the capital.
Hello, I'm Linton Besser. Welcome to Media Watch. And we're off and racing the next federal election called for May 3. And this time around, the beasts are being stalked by a whole new breed of hunter.
Influencers invited on campaign trail in election first.
And if you're wondering what an election might look like through the lens of a smartphone, look no further than last week's budget.
Missing Secretary Skelly's do the budget.
They literally lock us in a room with economists, with journalists, and the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, is going to take us through the budget.
We have survived. The trauma was real.
Invited into the much-vaunted budget lockup for the first time was a vanguard of TikTokers, podcasters, Instagrammers who were given early and privileged access to the government's detailed plans for the next 12 months.
So what's the rationale with the help debt?
The real kind of change has been the indexation arrangements.
Now, a final question, it's a big one. Can I get a signature on the front page?
The access granted to this new generation of storytellers was nothing short of extraordinary, including one-on-one interviews with a number of ministers and MPs making themselves available. But that's not all.
Today I am interviewing the Prime Minister, and so we will get ready together because I'm not stressed.
The following day, even Australia's head of government was throwing open his doors to these new players.
What gives you hope for the next generation, not just as a politician, but as a person?
About a dozen of them were summoned to Canberra for the VIP treatment. Now, your first few budget lockups are intimidating. Well, they were for me anyway, even with experienced colleagues to help. Just reading the papers is a significant challenge in the 6 hours you're given before the Treasurer's speech. So I can't imagine how difficult it would be to come into the lockup and do that with little experience or institutional backing behind you.
We're legit pulling up a Parliament House and we have no idea what we're getting ourselves into today.
The Labor Party was so thirsty for the attention of these newbies, it paid the travel costs for some of them to be there. In fact, this is the second year the Labor Party has done so. They weren't in the actual budget lockup in 2024, but Labor has confirmed it paid the travel and accommodation costs of as many as 13 of them to come to Canberra and conduct interviews. Both sides of politics are now very focused on these new opinion makers and have been taking to social media with gusto in the lead up to the election, with Peter Dutton also enjoying an easy run from Olympic diver Sam Fricker last week.
Super quick on housing. Sam, we want to build 500,000 new homes and we want to stop for a 2-year period foreigners from competing against young Australians bidding at auctions. We want Australian homes for Australians. And what about energy?
So why is this happening? The reality is voters are getting harder to reach and fewer of them are reading and watching the news. In fact, while free-to-air TV is still the most popular source of news for Australians, social media is not far behind. It's how almost 2/3 of 18 to 24-year-olds now access the news. Millie Rose Bannister is one of the new breed.
We can access audiences that they can't. I think traditional media is not reaching the way that influencers can, and content creators and educators on platforms and social media is playing a really important role.
Bannister may be right, but it's also true Labor and the Coalition are primed to use these budding channels to manipulate and spin and propagandise their way through to the end of this knife-edge federal poll. Now, to a story about war crimes, secret recordings and grave allegations about Australia's most decorated reporter, Nick McKenzie.
In breaking news, Ben Roberts-Smith has launched a fresh legal challenge as he appeals a defamation judgment over allegations of war crimes.
This week, recordings emerged where 9 journalist Nick McKenzie is heard claiming to have admitted Ben Roberts-Smith's ex-wife and a friend were briefing him on the war veteran's legal strategy.
This covert recording was first revealed last Monday night on Sky News, with Sharry Markson exhuming the multi-million-dollar defamation case that left former Special Forces soldier Ben Roberts-Smith branded a war criminal.
An explosive recording has caught Nine-Star reporter Nick McKenzie claiming he'd engaged in unethical behaviour during their famous war crime case.
And sure enough, she had the tape in which McKenzie refers to his lawyers.
I shouldn't tell you, I've just breached my ethics in doing that. Like, this is where, like, this is put me in a shit position now. Like, if they knew that, and Peter knew that, I'd get my ass down to the platter.
It was, by any measure, a damaging report for one of Australia's most successful investigative journalists, with the leaked recording now forming the basis of a fresh court action which Robert Smith hopes will upend one of the most significant defamation victories by a publisher in living memory. So, where did the recording come from? How exactly did Nick McKenzie breach his ethics? And amidst Ben Robert Smith's ongoing appeal, what might be the consequences? The recording was attached to this anonymous email sent to Ben Robert Smith's lawyers at 2:54 a.m. on a Saturday morning, 9 days before Sky News published. And it captured 1 minute and 24 seconds of a conversation between McKenzie and one of his newspaper's witnesses in the case that appeared to show Nick McKenzie had access to Robert Smith's confidential legal position.
You put Burmese actually calls out, please, on the name, which I've told you this. And they actively, like, briefing us on his legal strategy in respect of you.
It was a private conversation which McKenzie could not have known was being recorded. But these words would prove a major lapse of judgment from such an experienced player. What is not immediately self-apparent, however, is that this witness, known as Person 17, was giving evidence not about war crimes, but about allegations that Ben Robert Smith, with whom she'd carried out an illicit affair, had punched her in the face. And in this conversation, McKenzie is trying to reassure her that in fact Robert Smith's estranged wife, Emma Roberts, after a bitter and acrimonious separation, was now on their side, along with Emma's close friend, Danielle Scott.
The reason I told you that was to say, like, you know, we've got this, and they're not hostile to you, despite your worst fears. They're not.
McKenzie had been asked by his own lawyers not to tell Person 17 that his team did indeed have inside information courtesy of Emma Roberts and her friend Danielle, a trove of text messages and emails about how Ben Robert Smith planned to undermine Person 17's allegations. But McKenzie, desperate to reassure Person 17, contravened his lawyer's instructions and brought her into the secret.
I've told you that so many times now as well. And I had to tell you that extra bit to sort of prove it in your mind.
And maybe that's what has to happen. Like, so...
No, I shouldn't tell you. I've just breached my fucking ethics in doing that.
In the recording, we hear McKenzie expressly say this legal strategy concerned Person 17, whose evidence was all about her claims of domestic violence. But in the Ben Robert Smith camp, this recording was evidence of a much darker secret, that Nine's reporter was being fed privileged information about the former soldier's wider case by Emma Roberts, who had been secretly reading her ex-husband's emails.
Ben Robert Smith also claiming his emails were improperly accessed more than 100 times.
This isn't the first time Ben Robert Smith has raised these suspicions. 4 years ago, he sued his ex-wife, seeking to restrain her access to a jointly controlled email account, and issued subpoenas to Nine for any leaked material it had been supplied by Emma Roberts. But the publisher told the court it had no such documents, and the case was thrown out. Robert Smith tried to appeal that decision and lost again, which means this latest action will be the third time the email allegations are examined by the courts. McKenzie was also caught saying this on the recording.
No one knows about the police investigation. It's a sensitive, ongoing police investigation. Phone taps, task force. There's a whole new task force has been stood up in Brisbane. An entire new task force. There's police living in his apartment block under assumed identities as we speak. Like, the guy is...
Which meant, according to Sky News,
McKenzie could have jeopardised a sensitive police investigation, including the safety of undercover officers, by speaking about it to this unrelated witness, and even extraordinarily revealing the existence of phone taps.
But McKenzie was embellishing, because he himself had already published to the world details of 2 live AFP investigations into Ben Roberts-Smith in the 2 years prior. And while it's true there'd been no reporting that AFP agents had moved into the building, a detail Sharri Markson pointed out in her statement to Media Watch, Roberts-Smith had already been tipped off about the AFP's surveillance and was using burner phones to avoid it, which Markson failed to tell her viewers. The recording was ignored by Nine's outlets for 3 days, but not by the West Australian, which went big on the story. Absent from the paper's extensive reporting, however, was the rather salient fact that its proprietor, one Kerry Stokes, had a direct interest in blowing up Nine's successful defence, having funded Ben Roberts-Smith's case to the tune of an estimated $30 million. The most obvious problem in all of this is we've only heard the tiniest and surely most damaging snippet from what was clearly a longer conversation. So we contacted Person 17 to ask for access to the full tape, whomever recorded it. She declined to respond to our queries. In a statement, a spokesman for Nine told us the company had full confidence in its reporter.
There is no breach of legal privilege or ethical concerns. This is part of a sustained media campaign of misinformation designed to smear Nick's reporting and reputation.
We also sent questions to the West Australian, but didn't hear back. We asked Sharri Markson whether she contacted Person 17 to try to obtain the full recording and why important context about 17's defamation evidence was missing from her Sky News report. Here's what she said.
I would have thought you'd be asking your long-term friend and former colleague Nick McKenzie what he meant when he said he'd breached his ethics, rather than trying to identify the source of a recording that a federal court judge found significant enough to schedule an urgent hearing for.
Now, just for the record, I'm as much a friend of Nick McKenzie as I am of Sharri Markson. Earlier today, the federal court flagged a potential 2-day hearing to resolve Roberts-Smith's application. But let's not lose sight of what it was that established, to a civil standard at least, that Ben Roberts-Smith was a war criminal. It was not the evidence of Person 17, that's for sure, who the court ultimately ruled against, finding some of her evidence not sufficiently reliable. Rather, it was the testimony of Roberts-Smith's former brothers-in-arms which brought him down. And it's hard to see how those first-person accounts are in any way changed by McKenzie's misguided and over-trusting assurances to a witness he knew to be unreliable and who made not a jot of difference to the final outcome. And now we've come across a little gem, a touching story of man and beast working together on the sidelines of the world's most terrible conflict.
Private Wojtek, at your service.
Earlier this month, the Australian newspaper brought its readers a little story about a very big bear. The story of Wojtek, a feisty Syrian brown bear who accompanied Polish troops in World War II. The Australian spun a cracking yarn that began in the Middle East.
A young Iranian boy emerged from the hilly forests of Hamadan with a violently wriggling sack. The cub that would become the legendary Wojtek stuck his head out and wrestled to be free.
Oh. After buying Wojtek from the boy, the Polish troops raised him, taught him to walk upright and had him mucking in with the men.
When Wojtek saw a pair of men carrying 45-kilogram boxes of British-made 25-pounder shells up the hill, he joined in, lugging boxes.
A remarkable true story. And what an arresting image to accompany it. A photograph of Wojtek standing tall and proud alongside the Polish forces. Except, what's this? Yes, an earlier version of the photo shows... Hang on, Wojtek was a Nazi? No, you can breathe again. Wojtek was no Nazi because he was never in the photo to begin with. Here's the real thing, extracted from a documentary about the Luftwaffe paratroopers. The first clue is in the parachutes strapped to their backs, because where's Wojtek's chute? And the other clue is that, well, how do I put this? Bears don't jump out of planes. So how on earth did Wojtek end up fighting for the fatherland? The doctored image can be traced back to 2014, the creation of German film student Pascal Flirks, who painstakingly created a 3D model of a bear and superimposed him onto real scenes. Here he is, dangling from a parachute, alongside a burning tank, riding a motorcycle and just chilling with the boys. Pascal Flirks told us, in fact, his film and the bear had nothing to do with the real Wojtek.
The film tells the story of my grandfather's past. As an artistic choice, I abstracted my grandfather into the figure of a bear to convey the story.
But the truth behind the image was tossed aside as it was reposted online, suddenly bearing Wojtek's name, until finally the photoshopped fake was debunked 5 years ago, with the debunker telling us,
I find it worrying that such a large publication has failed to conduct basic research. In these days of rampant misinformation, it is especially important that we know that journalists at least know how to do due diligence.
We asked The Australian about its research cock-up and, as usual, heard nary a word in reply. But it probably did receive our email because the fake photograph has disappeared from its website. I suppose there's a lesson for all of us in Wojtek's story, because if a brown bear can learn to walk upright, carry munitions and help inspire a nation, then the Australian's journalists can learn to use their paws to execute a few more keystrokes and make sure its readers get the full grizzly rather than a stuffed teddy. And that's all from us tonight. Be sure to check us out on iView as well as X, YouTube and Facebook. You can find full statements on our website, and don't forget to send us your tips. See you next week.